Simon travels the King's Highway, based on the legend of the King's Highway by Beth Southwick, narrated by Kristen Standage. Once upon a time, in a splendid castle, a good and wise king sat pondering in his bedchamber. He was getting old, and began to worry about the future of his kingdom. His queen had died many years before, and he had no children in which to pass his crown. What was he to do? He considered all of his options and wondered, of everybody he knew, who would be fit to rule his people with fairness and grace. After careful consideration, the wise old king had an idea. He would devise a test to see who, of all his subjects, could prove his worthiness. Well before dawn of the very next morning, the king set his plan into action. In the middle of a well-traveled highway, the king dug a hole in the dirt, wherein he placed a hefty bag of gold. Then, with the help of his mighty horse, he rolled a large, heavy stone over it to cover the treasure. Winded and fatigued, the king then returned to his castle and waited. The first rays of sun began to peek over the eastern mountains, and the people of the prosperous kingdom began their day. When the villagers headed to their various places of labor, they had to dodge the boulder in the middle of the road, but no one worried about it. They were all too busy to get where they needed to be. As they skirted around the massive rock, each thought nearly the same thing. Surely someone will tell the king about this obstacle, and he will have it moved. With this small reassurance, they went on their way, without another thought. As the morning sun began to warm the earth, a learned professor traveled toward the castle to have an audience with the king. Filled with all the knowledge his great books had to offer, he was musing on what boundless wisdom he could boast to his liege, when suddenly his carriage stopped. The professor impatiently poked his head out of the window and beheld the boulder blocking their way. Ranting, he urged his driver to move around it. In obedience, the coachman carefully led his horses off the road into weeds and ruts as they skirted the massive stone, and shook the professor up as he did so. Someone should dispose of this obstruction. It is a menace to society. Not long afterward, a brave knight, clad in armor and riding a majestic horse, came upon the rock in the road. I will inform the king of this at once. He needs to do something about it before someone gets injured. And he rode on with haste to the castle. The sun was beaming high in the sky when a nobleman of wealth and society traveled the King's Highway with his train of distinguished friends and attendants. As they came upon the boulder that blocked their path, they smugly wondered how the king could allow such an unattractive nuisance to exist in view of his glorious castle. In considerable humiliation, they allowed themselves to be taken off the road into the weeds and the ruts, while they each groaned with the inconvenience and discomfort of it all. The king shall not hear the end of this! When the sun began its descent in the west, all the people headed home from their labors. As they passed the rock once again, they shook their heads in disgust. How very vexing! This should have been taken care of by now. Finally, at twilight, with his spade slung over his shoulder, a young man named Simon crossed the highway near the boulder. He was tired and hungry, and looking forward to putting his feet up after a long day in the fields. When he noticed the massive stone lying in the shadows, Simon exclaimed, "Oh my! This rock could be dangerous to a traveler unaware. I must find some way to move it." Simon set out at once to procure a large branch from a fallen tree. Finding one, he dragged the huge limb back to the road and shimmied it underneath the boulder. Then, exerting all of his brawn, Simon slowly levered the massive rock from off the hole, and with the rest of his strength, he rolled it safely out of the way. Panting, Simon sat down to catch his breath when he noticed something sticking out of the pit. Pushing himself to his feet, he went to investigate. What Simon discovered astonished him. This bag of gold must belong to someone noble. Perhaps the king will know what to do with it. So, instead of going home to feed his belly and rest his exhausted body, Simon filled the hole with dirt and wearily headed up the road to the castle, hefting the heavy bag of gold. Meanwhile, the king sat at table, listening to the learned professor, the brave knight, and the wealthy nobleman complain of the menacing stone which had blocked their pass. Sighing inwardly, the king wondered what would become of his kingdom after all. Suddenly, a page brought the news that a poor peasant man was without the walls and wished to return a bag of gold that he had found under a boulder on the king's highway. The king commanded, "Bring him here." After a few minutes, the high doors of the great hall opened, and a young man entered timidly, holding his cap in dirt-covered hands. Approaching the king, he bowed in reverence. "Your Majesty, I humbly beg your pardon. When I was returning to my home from the fields this evening, I found a great stone in the road, and when I moved it out of the way, this bag of gold was under it. I don't know who it belongs to, but I knew you could find its rightful owner, so I thought to bring it here to your castle." Looking on, the professor, the knight, and the wealthy nobleman all stared in disgust at the unkempt peasant kneeling before them. "How dare this pauper come in such a state before nobility?" The king stood and hushed his guests. Smiling warmly, he approached his humble subject. "Stand, young man. What is your name?" Simon, your Majesty." "Simon. To whom do you suppose this gold belongs?" To someone honorable and great, your Majesty." "Indeed, it does. It belongs to you, noble Simon." "Oh no, your Majesty, it does not. I only found it when I moved the rock." "And why did you move the stone, Simon? I can see that you are tired, and surely hungry. Were you not in a hurry to return home so you can rest?" "Most assuredly, your Majesty, I was, but there was a rock in the road that needed to be moved. Who better to do it than me?" "Ah, yes. Who better? My dear, dear Simon, I placed the gold under that stone, intended for the person who would, of his own volition, choose to move it. The gold is yours, as is my kingdom when I die. Come, sit down and eat with me. We have much to discuss." And that is how Simon, the humble pauper, became a prince.